I was 30 years old when I finally admitted to myself that I'd been financing my sister's entire life, and that admission didn't come with the kind of dramatic clarity you might expect. It came while I was standing in my parents' half bath at Thanksgiving, holding my phone in one hand and gripping the marble sink with the other, staring at a list of automatic payments I'd apparently agreed to years ago and never questioned again. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it actually begins. Not with the discovery, but with the setup. The way the stage was already perfectly constructed long before I walked across it. I arrived at my parents' house on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, as I always do. The drive from Seattle to their suburb takes about 4 hours if you don't stop, and I don't usually stop. I had made a dessert, a honey lavender panna cotta that I'd tested twice the night before because I don't do anything halfway, and I'd wrapped it carefully in an insulated container. This was already a 3-hour investment of my time, but that's what you do when you're the responsible one. You show up early, you bring homemade items, you help with the setup, you make yourself useful. My parents' house is large and traditional, the kind of place you maintain rather than live in. My mother had decorated it obsessively for the season, with cream and gold accents that coordinated across every room. She'd always had an instinct for appearances, for the presentation of everything, from home decor to Christmas cards, to how her daughters were presented to the wider world. Relatives were already there when I arrived. Aunts, uncles, cousins, the usual sprawl of a family that stays connected more out of obligation than genuine closeness. My Aunt Patricia was helping in the kitchen. My Uncle Robert was in the den with my father, watching football and drinking beer from brown bottles. My younger cousins were scattered around, some on phones, some actually engaged in conversation. It was the same structure we'd maintained for years, the same rhythm, the same roles. My mother came to greet me, kissed me on the cheek, and immediately took the panna cotta from my hands. "Emily, that was so thoughtful of you to make something," she said, in that voice she used when she was marking me as the dependable one in the presence of others. "You're so reliable. I honestly don't know what we'd do without you being so good with practical things." Good with practical things. That was the phrase she'd landed on for me. Not talented, not creative, not impressive. Practical. Useful. Dependable. As if I were a piece of furniture that happened to function. I smiled and moved past her into the kitchen, where I began helping without being asked. I washed my hands, assessed what still needed to be done, and started on the tasks that seemed most urgent. This was automatic, the product of a lifetime of the same pattern. Be helpful. Fill the gaps. Don't draw attention. Don't be a problem. Don't require anything. I remember watching my hands as I chopped vegetables, thinking about how I'd spent the morning at work closing out a complicated audit at my firm. We'd discovered a 6-figure discrepancy in the accounts payable department, and I'd been the one to trace it back to a vendor kickback scheme. My boss had emailed me afterward saying my attention to detail was exceptional, that I had a real future in forensic accounting if I ever wanted to move in that direction. But that's not the kind of thing you lead with when you're standing in your mother's kitchen. That's the kind of thing that makes people uncomfortable, that marks you as ambitious, possibly difficult. So instead I said, "Thanks for having me," and kept chopping. Olivia arrived around 5 o'clock, just as my father had asked me to start setting the table. She came through the front door the way she always did, with an announcement, with presence, with an energy that seemed to draw everyone toward her like she was the sun, and we were all small orbiting objects who had no choice but to acknowledge her light. "I'm here!" she called out, and you could hear it immediately, the shift in the house's attention. My mother actually gasped a little, delighted, and hurried toward the foyer, abandoning the conversation she'd been having. I watched from the dining room where I was laying out place cards. Olivia was wearing a camel-colored coat that probably cost more than my car payment, and when she took it off, you could see the designer dress underneath, something sleek and effortlessly expensive. Her hair was perfect. Her makeup was done in that casual-looking way that definitely takes effort and money. Everything about her was polished, from her expensive handbag to her meticulously sculpted eyebrows. "Olivia, honey, you look absolutely stunning," my mother said, and I could hear something in her voice that I'd learned to recognize years ago. It was admiration mixed with something else, a kind of pride that came from the appearance of her daughter, as if Olivia's beauty and expensive presentation reflected something about my mother's own worth. My father appeared from the den. "There's my girl," he said, and his voice was warm in a way I'd stopped expecting to hear directed at me years ago. I finished the place cards and carried the rest of the silverware to the table, moving around the edges of the room the way you do when you're trying not to be in the way of someone else's moment. "You look amazing," my Aunt Patricia called out. She was the kind of relative who always took the easiest conversational path, and nothing was easier than complimenting Olivia's appearance. "Where did you get that dress?" "Oh, this little thing?" Olivia said, and I could hear the smile in her voice, the practiced lightness of someone who knows that false modesty is expected even when you're obviously not modest at all. "Just something I found. I've been so busy with work, I barely had time to find anything to wear." This was one of her favorite topics. How busy she was, how much her work was demanding of her, how successful she was becoming in whatever it was she did. The details of her work were always vague. She had something to do with real estate investment, or maybe it was network marketing, or possibly consulting for small businesses. The specifics shifted depending on who was asking and what seemed most impressive at the moment. What was consistent was that she was always on the verge of something huge, always one deal away from major success, always working harder than anyone else she knew. "Tell us everything," my mother said, linking her arm through Olivia's and guiding her toward the living room. "How's the business going? Tell me you're finally making the kind of money you deserve." And that was it. I was alone in the dining room, holding the remaining silverware, while the rest of the family gathered around Olivia like she'd just walked in from some other realm entirely. I finished setting the table methodically, checking that everything was aligned properly, that each place setting matched, that the centerpiece was positioned correctly in the middle. These things matter when you're the person responsible for making sure everything works. These things matter because they're one of the few things you can actually control. Throughout the evening, I watched the dynamic play out the way it always does. Olivia held court in the living room, telling an anecdote about a potential investor she'd met, gesturing dramatically, making everyone laugh. My father was engaged in a way he rarely is, leaning forward, asking follow-up questions, clearly proud. My mother watched her with an expression that was almost maternal worship, the way you look at something you created that turned out to be beautiful. My Uncle Robert asked me how work was going, which was kind of him. I told him it was steady, that we had a busy audit season coming up. He nodded, made a comment about how important it is to have people who are careful with details, and then his attention drifted back to Olivia, who was now telling a story about a client emergency and how she'd heroically solved it at the last minute. None of this was new. This pattern had been established over decades. Olivia was the golden child, beautiful, charismatic, ambitious in a way that seemed exciting rather than threatening. I was the competent one, the one you trusted with details, the one you called when you needed something done properly. We were cast in roles so specific and so early in our lives that questioning them seemed almost impossible. It was just how things were. It was just who we were. By the time dinner was served the next evening, I'd helped prepare most of it. Turkey, stuffing, green bean casserole, mashed potatoes, 3 different kinds of cranberry sauce, because my mother liked options. I'd been up at 6 in the morning helping with the last-minute preparations, keeping my movements small and efficient so I wouldn't be in the way while Olivia slept in, and then eventually emerged around 11, looking refreshed and perfect. The table was extended to accommodate everyone. There were maybe 20 of us. Parents, siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins. My seat was near one end, with Olivia positioned prominently near the head of the table where my father sat. The placement was never something anyone explicitly decided. It just happened. Olivia always ended up near the middle of attention. I always ended up at the edges. We'd been eating for about 20 minutes when my Uncle Rick turned to me and asked if I could help him with something. He was looking for financial advice. His business had been hit hard by inflation, and he was trying to figure out his options for restructuring his line of credit. It was the kind of question I answered regularly at work, and I immediately shifted into professional mode, asking him clarifying questions, walking through different scenarios, helping him think through the trade-offs. My mother was listening to this conversation, and somewhere in the middle of it, while I was explaining the difference between a bridge loan and a traditional refinance, she actually interrupted me. "You know," she said, turning to look at me and then pivoting to look at Olivia. "Olivia would be great at this kind of thing too. Liv, don't you work with small business financing?" The question itself was odd, because I wasn't sure Olivia actually did that. I'd never heard her mention it before. But Olivia, unfazed and always ready for a chance to present herself as competent, smiled and said, "I mean, I've dealt with business investment, sure. I'm actually pretty great with money." And then she laughed in a way that was casual and confident. The problem was that last statement. "I'm actually pretty great with money." I felt something shift in my chest, a kind of pressure that hadn't been there a moment before. I'm great with money. I'm the one who's great with money. That's my thing, the one thing I'm reliably recognized for, and she was just casually taking it. "Actually," my mother said, and now she was addressing Uncle Rick, "Olivia's probably your best resource. She's got such an impressive head for business." I watched Uncle Rick's face shift. He'd been looking at me before, and now his attention was turning toward Olivia. The conversation was transferring. The expertise was being reassigned without any particular reason, except that Olivia looked more impressive, dressed better, smiled more broadly. "Oh, I don't know if I'm the best person to ask," Olivia said, but her tone was that false modest thing again, the one that made it clear she definitely thought she was the best person to ask. "But I'm always happy to talk about it. Rick, when you have a moment, let's grab some coffee and chat." And Uncle Rick nodded and said that would be great, and the conversation moved away from me entirely. I went back to eating, cutting my turkey into smaller and smaller pieces, each one exactly the same size. Methodical, controlled. A small way of maintaining order in a moment that felt disordered. That's when it happened, though. The thing that made me actually look up and see the full shape of what had been happening to me for years. Olivia was telling a story now, something about a client who had trusted her with a major investment decision, and how she'd helped them make money when everyone else had written them off. It was vague and impressive, and probably not entirely true, but the family was eating it up. And then, somewhere in the middle of this story, she actually looked directly at me and said, "I'm so glad I'm actually good with money, unlike some people. Emily's always asking me for financial advice." The table went quiet for a beat. Not a shocked quiet, more like the quiet of a moment where everyone could sense something had happened, but wasn't quite sure what. My Aunt Patricia laughed uncomfortably. My cousin Jake looked at me with a kind of cringe confusion, like he wasn't sure if this was a joke or an accusation. Emily's always asking me for financial advice. Emily can't handle her own money. Emily is dependent on Olivia for guidance. It was a complete inversion of reality, and it was being presented as casual fact to the entire family. I didn't argue. I didn't correct her. I just felt my stomach contract and set down my fork. "That's not—" I started, but my mother had already jumped in, reaching over to touch Olivia's arm with amusement, as if this was a funny family quirk we were all in on together. "Oh, you two," she said, in that tone that suggested we were being silly, both of us, in equal measure. Always looking out for each other. My father changed the subject immediately, asking someone about the football game that was on later. The topic shifted away like a boat pushing off from shore. I was left with my unsaid correction, my turkey, and the clear understanding that no one wanted to hear what I had to say in that moment. It was easier to move on. It was easier to let the false statement sit there and become part of the evening's narrative. I excused myself about 20 minutes later, pleading a headache, which wasn't entirely false. I moved through the kitchen, doing what I always do, clearing dishes, helping to portion out dessert, and made my way upstairs to the half bath off the hallway. I locked the door and sat on the closed toilet seat for a moment, just breathing, letting my heart rate come back down. This was fine. I was fine. Olivia had said something stupid, and it had been navigated past. This was normal family dynamics. Nothing had actually happened, except it had. Something had definitely happened, and pretending it hadn't was a choice I'd made automatically, without even thinking about it. I pulled out my phone. I wasn't sure why. Some impulse toward distraction, maybe, or maybe some deeper instinct that told me I needed to understand something about my own life. I opened my banking app and started scrolling through my transaction history, and that's when I saw them. One after another, recurring transactions, month after month, year after year. Olivia car insurance, $180 every month. Olivia credit card and $300 twice a month. Olivia personal loan, $500 every other week. At first, I thought I was misreading something. But as I scrolled further back, further into months and then into years, I could see the pattern. It had started small, $100 here, $150 there. But it had grown. It had become systematic. I'd set these up. I'd authorized these transfers. And somewhere along the way they'd become so automatic that I'd stopped actually noticing them, stopped actually questioning why I was doing it. My hands felt cold. I started adding them up in my head, scrolling back through months, through years, trying to get a complete picture of what I was looking at. Car insurance, credit cards, personal loans, rent contributions, medical bills, flights, hotel stays. Olivia needed things, and somehow I'd become the person who paid for them. I did the math. Roughly $180 a month for car insurance for 5 years. Roughly $300 twice a month for credit cards for 4 years. Roughly $500 every other week for a personal loan for 3 years. And then there were the irregular payments, the emergencies, the one-off requests that had turned into recurring items. I was looking at something in the range of $50,000. Maybe more. Maybe significantly more. I felt very still. I felt like I was made of glass and someone had just tapped me, and I was in that moment before the crack decides whether it's going to run or stay still. I didn't cry. I didn't get angry, not exactly. I just felt something very clear and very cold move through me. And without quite letting myself think about what I was doing, I opened my banking app and started canceling payments. One by one, I went through and canceled the recurring transactions. The car insurance, the first credit card, the personal loan. I scrolled back through months and months of her emergencies, her needs, and I canceled them all. It took about 10 minutes. When I was done, I just sat there, looking at the list of canceled payments, feeling like I'd pressed a button that couldn't be unpressed. I waited maybe 30 seconds, half expecting some alarm to go off, some warning from the universe that I'd made a mistake, that this wasn't the kind of thing you actually did, that you didn't just unilaterally make a financial decision like that without talking to people first, without being gentle about it, without managing everyone's emotions. Nothing happened. The cancellations just sat there in my banking app, real and final. I washed my hands, checked my face in the mirror, still composed, still controlled, still Emily, and went back downstairs. The rest of the evening passed in a strange daze. I served dessert. I made coffee. I listened to conversations happening around me that felt like they were happening in another dimension. My mother commented that my panna cotta was delicious. Olivia didn't mention it. She was already on her phone, texting or scrolling, no longer the center of attention because the dinner was winding down, because the performance period had passed. I drove back to Seattle late that night. Usually I wait until morning, but something made me want to leave, to get back to my own space, to sleep in my own bed. I told my mother I had an early meeting, which was a lie. But it was a smooth lie, the kind no one questions because it's practical and reasonable. Of course Emily has an early meeting. Emily always has something work-related happening. The drive back was dark and quiet. I had a playlist running, but I wasn't really listening to it. I was thinking about the moment when I'd canceled those payments, and I was trying to figure out what came next, because this had been an action without a plan, a reflex without a destination, and I had absolutely no idea what was going to happen now. By the morning, my phone started buzzing. I was already up, already at my desk with a cup of coffee, already working on something for my own life, when the first message came through from Olivia. Why is my car insurance not going through? Then, about an hour later, Emily, I got a notification that my credit card payment failed. What's happening? Then, Mom said you left last night. Is something wrong? Then, this isn't funny. I need that loan payment to go through or my credit is going to be affected. I read them without responding. I was operating from a place of calm that felt a little strange, a little like I was watching myself from outside my body. This was what clarity felt like, I realized. This was what it felt like to stop pretending something different than what was true. I opened a spreadsheet on my computer and began to work. I pulled up all of my bank statements from the past 5 years. I went through every transaction systematically, documenting each payment to Olivia, noting the date, the amount, the category. I color-coded them. I created subtotals. Car insurance went in one column, credit card payments in another, rent contributions, medical bills, emergency loans, flights home for holidays and last-minute visits, restaurant charges because she'd wanted to go out and hadn't brought her wallet, retail purchases because she'd seen something she needed and asked if I could buy it for her. The spreadsheet grew as I added it all up. 30 pages, 40, 50. The total number at the bottom was $67,432. I looked at that number for a long time. That was more money than I made in a year after taxes. That was a significant portion of my savings. That was money I'd earned through my work, my effort, my specific skills that my family was apparently so adequate with that they didn't really need to notice when Olivia demonstrated a complete lack of financial responsibility. By that afternoon, my mother called. Her voice was controlled but tight, the way it got when she was upset, but was trying to manage that upset in a way that still made her look good. Emily, what is going on with your sister? What do you mean? I asked. I was calm, extremely calm. It was actually kind of remarkable how calm I was being. Olivia says you've canceled your support for her payments. She's very upset. Her car insurance is going to lapse. Her credit cards are going to... Emily, you need to put those back. No, I don't, I said. And I could hear surprise in the silence that followed, because that's not how I talk to my mother. That's not how I'm supposed to respond to her requests. What do you mean, no? Olivia needs those payments. You've been helping her with... Helping her? I interrupted, and I could hear my own voice starting to shift away from calm, getting sharper. I'm not helping her. I'm financing her entire life. I have been for years. I'm not doing it anymore. There was another silence. I could practically hear my mother recalibrating, trying to figure out how to reframe this, how to make this about my unreasonableness instead of what was actually happening. That's not fair, she said finally. Olivia is going through a difficult time. You know she hasn't had the same kind of stability that you've had. Because she's made different choices, I said. Not because I haven't helped her. I've helped her so much that I've been financing the choices that haven't worked out. You're being cruel, my mother said, and I could hear actual hurt in her voice, which meant I was doing something that disrupted her ability to see herself as a good person, as a good mother. And that was worse than if she'd just gotten angry. I don't recognize you right now. This isn't who you are, and who... Maybe it's who I should be, I said, and I hung up. I didn't hear from my father that day, but the next morning, he called me at work. He was quiet, the way he got when he was uncomfortable, and he was using his disappointed voice, the one that made me feel like I'd failed at something fundamental. Your mother is very upset, he said. Whatever's going on with you and Olivia, you need to work it out in a way that doesn't hurt our family. I'm not hurting the family, I said. I'm stopping hurting myself. That's a selfish way of looking at it, he said. And the words landed exactly where they were supposed to land, in that place inside me that had been trained to prioritize the family's comfort over my own well-being. I gave $67,000 to my sister, I said flatly. I have documentation of every single payment. I was not asked to do this. I was not asked to continue doing it. It just became something that happened, and I just kept letting it happen. That's not a sustainable way to live. She's your sister, he said, as if that explained everything, as if that particular biological fact should override every other consideration. I know, I said. And she's also a 30-year-old adult who needs to figure out how to manage her own finances. Emily, you're not thinking clearly right now. Let's wait a few days and talk about this in person. We can work something out. But I didn't want to work something out. For the first time in my life, I didn't want to compromise. I didn't want to find the middle ground. I didn't want to be reasonable. I'll think about it, I said, because that was still automatic, still what you say to your father when he's disappointed in you. But I wasn't actually planning to think about it. I was planning to stand exactly where I was standing. The messages from Olivia started escalating on Thursday. She'd moved past confusion and into panic, and her panic was manifesting as a kind of escalating desperation that made me almost feel bad, except that feeling bad was what had gotten me into this situation in the first place. Emily, I really need to talk to you, she texted. Please call me. I don't understand why you're doing this to me. Mom says you're upset about something. I honestly don't know what I did. That last one made me actually laugh, which was maybe not a healthy sign. I sent her a link to the spreadsheet I'd created. Not the detailed one, a summary version, with totals by category and a grand total at the bottom. Just the facts. Just the number. The response came almost immediately. What the fuck, Emily? And then, these are things I asked you to help with. You're making this seem like I stole from you. And then, you know my situation is complicated right now. You know I'm between jobs. You're being a bitch. I read that word and felt something land in my stomach that was almost like relief. Because finally, she was being honest. Finally, the mask was slipping. Finally, I was getting something that actually matched the reality of what was happening instead of the narrative that had been presented to me. I didn't respond. I just saved that message, and then I did something I'd never done before. I called Mark Reynolds, Olivia's boyfriend, or fiancé, or whatever he was. Their relationship status changed as frequently as Olivia's job situation. He answered on the third ring, sounding confused. Emily, is everything okay? Is Olivia hurt? Emotionally, I said. Maybe. But no, she's physically fine. I'm calling because I want to know if you know how much money I've given her. There was a pause. I could hear him recalibrating on the other end of the phone, trying to figure out what was happening. I don't think that's really my business, he said carefully. $67,000, I said. Over the past 5 years. Car insurance, credit cards, personal loans, emergencies, rent, food, flights, clothes, retail therapy. Every category of need and want that she's had, I've been paying for. Another pause. This one felt different. Jesus, Mark said quietly. 67,000? Do you know how much other debt she has? Emily, I really don't think... I think you do know, actually, I interrupted. I think you know she's in debt, and I think you know where that money is going, and I think maybe you know more about the actual state of her financial situation than anyone else. There was silence for a long time. Long enough that I thought he might have hung up. She owes about another $100,000, he said finally. Credit cards mostly. Some of that car is financed. There are other loans. I didn't know about your contributions until just now, but yeah, she's not doing well financially. She's not telling your family how bad it is. $100,000. 67 of it from me, which meant she owed almost 30,000 more beyond what I'd been providing. That meant her situation was even worse than I'd thought, which meant my cancellation of the payments, while necessary, was going to hit her even harder than I'd calculated. Has she told you about her job? I asked. She doesn't have a job, Emily. She hasn't had a stable job in 2 years. The real estate thing didn't work out. The network marketing thing before that didn't work out. She keeps starting things and stopping things. And meanwhile, the debt keeps growing. And I keep thinking it's going to get better. Why haven't you said anything to her? I asked. Because every time I try to have a conversation about it, she cries and says I don't support her, that I don't believe in her, that I'm being unsupportive of her entrepreneurial dreams. And I don't want to be that guy, you know? So I just let it go. I understood that impulse so completely that it almost made me angry. He'd been conditioned into the same pattern I had. He'd learned to manage her emotions instead of confronting her behavior. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "And I'm sorry, but I'm not going to resume those payments." "I wouldn't ask you to," Mark said, and he sounded relieved, which told me a lot about how much this situation was weighing on him. Olivia showed up at my office on Friday. Just appeared, walking past my assistant and directly into my workspace, which was something that would have gotten anyone else escorted out by security. But she was family, and family had special permissions even when they were making scenes in professional environments. She looked like she hadn't slept. No makeup, no designer clothes, no performance. Just a woman in sweatpants and a hoodie who'd driven across the city because something had shattered inside her plans. "I need you to understand something," she said, and her voice was shaking. "I never asked you to give me that money. You offered. You've always offered. You've always been there, and I've learned to count on you, and now you're punishing me for that." "I'm not punishing you," I said. I was very aware that my office had glass walls, that people could see us, that this was becoming a spectacle. "I'm stopping. There's a difference." "It doesn't feel like a difference. It feels like you're destroying me because you're angry about something." "I'm not angry," I said, and I realized it was true. I wasn't angry. I was something else, something colder and more clear. "I'm just done." "Done with what? Done with me? Done with our family?" "Done with financing a life for someone who has every advantage I have and twice the resources, and who's decided that the way to live is to let other people pay for things." Olivia's face crumpled then, and the tears started coming, and I watched her shift into a different kind of performance. The victim performance, where she was the one being wronged, where I was the villain in this story, where my withdrawal of financial support was an act of cruelty rather than an act of self-preservation. "I hate you," she said, and it came out like a whisper, like she was saying something true that she didn't want to say. "I hate that you're being like this. I hate that you're making me the bad guy." "I'm not making you anything," I said. "You are who you are. I'm just finally seeing it." She left after that, crying, walking out the way she'd walked in, and I had to spend the next hour explaining to my supervisor why my sister had created a scene in my workspace. He was kind about it. He had his own complicated family situation, but I could tell it registered as unprofessional, as personal drama bleeding into my professional space. The family intervention came the following week. My mother called and told me that we needed to have a family meeting, that everyone was concerned about the situation, that Olivia was struggling, and that we needed to come together to figure out how to support her. It was scheduled for a Sunday at my parents' house. I almost didn't go. I came very close to saying no, to establishing a boundary that extended beyond finances and into family participation itself. But I went. Because the part of me that was still the reliable one, still the one who showed up and made things work, was still stronger than the part of me that knew I should probably stay away. When I arrived, everyone was already there. My parents, Olivia, Mark, even some of my extended family who I think my mother had recruited to make her point. The living room had been arranged like we were about to have some kind of therapeutic intervention, which I suppose we were. My mother started by saying that we were here because we loved each other, and because family was important, and because they were concerned that recent decisions were threatening the stability of our family unit. She looked at me when she said this, which told me that in her version of events, I was the problem. My father followed with something about how difficult times require compassion, and about how Olivia had made some choices that hadn't worked out, and about how we all needed to be there to support her. Then Olivia spoke, and she gave a performance that was actually impressive, I'll admit. She talked about her struggles with self-doubt, about how she'd always felt like she had something to prove because I was so academically successful, about how I'd made her feel inadequate, about how my withdrawal of support felt like abandonment. I listened to her talk about how I'd made her feel, And I realized something very clearly. She had a complete alternate reality constructed in her mind. In her version of events, I was the villain. I was the successful one. And my success had somehow damaged her. And my financial support had been both my way of trying to make up for my success and also my way of keeping her dependent on me. It was a narrative that was creative and painful and absolutely untrue, but it was the narrative she believed, and everyone in the room seemed to be sympathizing with her. Mark eventually spoke up, though. He looked uncomfortable, but he pulled out a file folder and started presenting the actual financial situation: the debt, the income, the pattern of spending, the mathematical reality of what was happening. He was very methodical about it. He's in accounting, apparently, and has been keeping careful records. And he presented it all very clearly. My father's face shifted when he saw the numbers. My mother's face shifted in a different direction, into something that looked like betrayal. Like Mark had chosen me over Olivia by presenting facts that contradicted the narrative she'd constructed. And that's when my father actually apologized. Not a performance apology, not a "I'm sorry you feel that way" apology. An actual apology where he said he hadn't understood the extent of the situation, that he'd been wrong to pressure me to continue the financial support, that he recognized I'd been enabling a problem rather than helping solve it. My mother didn't apologize. She said something about how we were all being very harsh on Olivia, and how she was clearly struggling, and how the family needed to come together instead of tearing each other apart. Olivia didn't say much after that. She mostly sat there looking small, which was strange because I'd seen her take up so much space for so long that seeing her reduced was almost harder than seeing her angry. I said, before I left, that I wasn't trying to hurt anyone, that I was trying to take care of myself, that I understood she was struggling, but that I couldn't keep financing her life, and that eventually that was going to have to come from somewhere real, from actual work, actual income, actual responsibility. She didn't respond. Mark looked grateful that someone had said it. My father looked tired. My mother looked angry. The next several months were strange. Olivia actually got a job, a real job, in a coffee shop, making minimum wage. It wasn't impressive or glamorous or any of the things she'd been claiming to do, but it was real income. And it was work she was doing herself. She started making payments toward her debt, small ones, but consistent. Our family dynamic shifted in ways that were subtle but real. There were fewer obligations. My mother stopped calling with emergencies that were actually Olivia's emergencies. My father stopped asking me to make exceptions or special circumstances. I stopped being the solution to every problem. For the first time in a very long time, I had space to think about what I actually wanted, what I actually needed, what I could actually afford to give without emptying myself. I started investing in my own life. I moved to a nicer apartment. I started saving for a down payment on a house. I took a vacation by myself, something I'd never done because I was always either working or managing family obligations. I hired a therapist to help me understand how I'd gotten into a pattern of sacrificing my own financial security for someone else's comfort. Olivia and I didn't talk much during this period. It was strange, existing in the same family but maintaining a distance. But it was also necessary. I needed to establish what my actual boundaries were, and that required not being in constant relationship with the person who had benefited most from my lack of boundaries. By the time the next Thanksgiving came around, a year after everything had shifted, things had changed enough that it felt like a different holiday entirely. My mother had planned a smaller gathering, just immediate family, just my parents, me, Olivia, and Mark. No extended relatives, no performance audience, just the people who actually mattered and who would have to sit with the consequences of their own behavior. Olivia showed up in regular clothes. No designer anything. Her car was older, less flashy. She'd cut her hair short, which wasn't a change I understood initially, but I think maybe it was a way of stepping out of the version of herself she'd been constructing. We didn't have a big conversation about everything that had happened. We weren't that kind of family. But she did, at one point, say something while we were preparing the table together. She said, "I know what I was doing. I think I've always known, actually. I just didn't want to have to stop. It was the most honest thing I'd ever heard her say, and I appreciated it, even though it didn't change anything. Even though accepting responsibility didn't erase the years where she'd been willing to let me sacrifice my own financial security. "That's something," I said back, because I didn't know what else to say, and because I was trying to be the kind of person who could acknowledge growth even when it came late. Dinner was quieter than previous Thanksgivings. There were no dramatic stories about business successes. There was no performance, at least not in the way there had been before. My father carved the turkey and passed plates around. My mother brought out the food that we'd prepared. I thought about my panna cotta from the previous year, how it had been received with that reductive praise, how I'd been thanked for being practical rather than celebrated for being creative. This year, I'd made something different. A pie, actually. Apple, with a complicated lattice crust that I'd done just for the challenge of it. Not because anyone expected it or needed it, but because I wanted to make it. Because I wanted to create something beautiful for myself. And if it happened to be something that other people could enjoy, that was fine, but it wasn't the point. "This is beautiful," my mother said, looking at the pie. "You really don't have to make these things for us, you know." "I know," I said. "I wanted to make it." And that distinction felt important, that I was there because I wanted to be, not because I was expected to be. That I was contributing because I chose to, not because I was the reliable one who made things work. That I was thinking about what I wanted, not just what everyone else needed. We didn't solve any of the deeper problems. We didn't have the conversation that fixed everything or healed the family or created some new dynamic that was completely different from what it had been. That's not how family works. That's not how years of patterns and roles and expectations suddenly just disappear, because one person decided to establish a boundary. But there was something different in the air. There was the acknowledgement that things had changed, that we couldn't go back to the way things had been, that whatever came next was going to require all of us to figure out how to relate to each other in a way that wasn't based on one person sacrificing and everyone else accepting that sacrifice. After dinner, I sat in my car before driving back to Seattle. The city lights were visible in the distance. It was cold, but clear, the kind of November night that makes you feel like anything is possible if you're willing to work for it. I thought about the me of a year ago, sitting in that half bath, discovering the spreadsheet of my own financial exploitation. I thought about how frozen I'd felt, how I'd made the decision to cancel the payments not because I knew what would come next, but because I couldn't keep going the way I'd been going. I thought about the person I'd been before all of this, the one who defined herself by being helpful, by being responsible, by being the one everyone could count on. I didn't regret the person I'd been. I wouldn't have survived my family otherwise. I would have shattered completely under the weight of their expectations if I hadn't developed the ability to absorb their needs, to make myself smaller, to prioritize their comfort. But I couldn't be that person anymore. It wasn't sustainable. It wasn't right. And more importantly, it wasn't good for either of us. Not for me, because I was sacrificing my own security, and not for Olivia, because I was enabling her to avoid facing the consequences of her own choices. I'm not sure yet what comes next, or what our family looks like 5 years from now, or whether Olivia and I ever actually repair our relationship. I'm not sure if my mother will eventually accept that her version of family unity requires more flexibility than she's willing to offer. I'm not sure if my father will ever be completely comfortable with his daughter prioritizing herself over family needs. But I'm certain of this. I can't go back. I can't unknow what I know about myself. I can't unsee the ways I've been disappearing in service of other people's comfort. And maybe the real measure of growth isn't whether everything gets fixed, but whether you have the courage to stand in what you know is true, even when everyone around you would prefer a different story. Even when you're not sure what comes next, at least you're not pretending anymore. At least you're being honest. And that, I'm learning, might be enough to build something real on.